Analog photography, the process of creating an image chemically by controlling the amount of light passing through a lens that then hits a light-sensitive piece of film. The emulsion on the film then reacts to the light, a bit like getting burned, and engraves a physical picture on itself. That picture can then be developed and saved with a chemical developing process. Finally, the film can then be used for projection, scanning, or printing the picture. Digital photography, on the other hand, has made this process easier, faster, and generally more efficient by using a light-sensitive sensor instead of film. The sensor then measures the light information and saves it on a digital storage unit, such as an SD card. In the late 90s, digital photography began its conquering of the mainstream consumer camera technology, and within the first few years of the 21st century, digital photography took over the market. Although the society has vastly adapted to a digitalized lifestyle, which enables optimized comfort for the consumer, an increasing popularity in the use of analog media is currently apparent. In particular, young people who grew up in an already digital world and thus have not had contact to analog media are beginning to use film cameras and are bringing the analog industry back to life. In March of this year, I completed my first of 2 bachelor theses I need to write for my uni degree, and so the topic for this first one I decided was going to be this phenomenon. The renaissance of analog photography is what I called it, I think. And although I don't really enjoy writing such papers, just me personally, I did learn a lot and collected a lot of information which I think is worth sharing, and that is this video. So today I want to discuss the causes of this situation and begin a conversation within the community on why you personally shoot film, assuming you shoot film. So here is a simplified video version of my bachelor thesis. To find possible explanations for this phenomenon, I created a comparative analysis of digital and analog photography on the basis of theoretical positions from chosen aspects of the topic. A central concept for the analysis is analog nostalgia. I attempted to illustrate multiple perspectives of the concept and expanded the research by including the position of photographic authenticity in the discussion. Additionally, the analysis takes into consideration the relevance of the aura, especially in reference to materiality in photography, to assist the evaluation of the phenomenon. However, before diving into that, let me give you a brief historical summary of the supposed death of analog photography. The brand we all know as one of the main film manufacturers, Kodak, once used to be the biggest and most relevant company for photography. Not only film, but anything that has to do with photography, so cameras as well. This makes it somewhat ironic that the first digital camera to be introduced was by Kodak themselves. In the year 1990, they announced their 1.3 megapixel digital camera, the DCS-100. It took about another decade until digital cameras started to become popular among the average consumer. And it took just a bit more than another decade for digital cameras to defeat the analog market. In 2012, the once so mighty Kodak company had to file for bankruptcy. That was the point when film photography was finally thought to be dead. But as you know, it surely wasn't. Slowly, a couple years after Kodak's bankruptcy, Kodak Alaris, the successor company of Kodak, was showing a small growth in their sales. It seemed as if the bottom had been reached and now the company was ready to move upwards again. Year by year, the sales increased again and people were buying film. This went so far that 2018, Kodak decided to reintroduce their previously discontinued film Kodak Ektachrome. And as you have probably noticed yourself, film photography is nowadays very far from being dead. It's in the midst of a resurgence, and within this development there is one key factor that makes this phenomenon all the more interesting: the consumers. One might expect that the people causing this revival of the analog industry are consumers of the generations who have experienced film photography and now miss it in this new digital age. Interestingly, the majority of consumers nowadays are young people, so young that it can be assumed that most of them have never been in contact with analog media before. A great example is me, because I grew up in a vastly digitalized world. I don't remember my parents or me shooting 35mm film. Instead, I remember that we had these cute digital point-and-shoots. In my research for my bachelor thesis, I found a fitting term for this generation, the digital natives. The American writer and speaker on education, Mark Prensky, is known as the creator of the terms digital natives and digital immigrants. The digital natives, like me, are the generations born during or after the digitalization and therefore grew up with digital media. The digital immigrants, on the other hand, are the generations who were born before the digitalization and have therefore experienced both the analog and digital age. The central differences Prensky refers to when comparing the two groups are their way of interacting with digital media. So, how come the majority of consumers reviving film photography are digital natives? This is where it gets theoretical. There are many factors which may be essential for this phenomenon, one of which is analog nostalgia. I read a lot about the term analog nostalgia for my paper, mostly written by Dominic Schrey. He writes that analog nostalgia is both a phenomenon and a visual effect in digital media. He summarizes the term nostalgia as this feeling of longing a place or a time. It's a feeling we tend to wallow in because mostly the place or time we long for is unreachable. A common example is the desire for childhood times. Because this is temporal, it cannot be reached, hence the desire stays unsatisfied. Schrey writes that this can result in creative energy created by these feelings, which may have heavy influence on our art. A common expression of analog nostalgia in digital media is the digital imitation of analog qualities. Here again, I myself am actually a perfect example for this because I like to add grain to my photos, which is a typical quality of film photography. But this goes far beyond me adding grain in Lightroom. When skipping through the various filters on Instagram, you will recognize a noticeable tendency to replicating analog aesthetics. This can be considered as a substitute home, as Dominic Schrey might describe it. The concept here is that when the object or time we long for when feeling nostalgic is unreachable, this might result in the creation of a substitution. It's called substitute home because the classic understanding of nostalgia was a longing for home. This substitution is an attempt to satisfy or at least soothe the desire. However, it can also result in a cycle instead. The substitution reminds of the actual desired thing and recalls the original feeling of desire. So, what analog nostalgia is suggesting is that we simulate analog aesthetics in hope of calming our desire for real analog media. This consequently begs the question, why not actually return to analog media? These days, we are lucky enough to still have access to the analog technologies of the past. And so, this could be the reason for an increasing interest in film photography among young people. However, there's one concern in this concept which I haven't yet mentioned, which flaws the ideas presented above. The digital natives who are now returning to analog media aren't actually returning because they've never experienced analog media. The analog media they are experiencing is a longing for a past before their own existence, a time, culture, and technology they didn't even experience themselves. As was to be expected, there's more to this topic than just this one concept, and so I continued my search for possible reasons why so many young people, including me, are attracted by analog media, and this brought me to the term aura. The aura is something that surrounds an object or a person that emits a feeling to the person interacting with the object or person. When applied on a piece of art, it can be an atmosphere around the piece, which makes it unique. At least, that is one of the many varying explanations one can find, this particular one being from the German philosopher and essayist Walter Benjamin. Although his work has often been declared as outdated, I took it into consideration for my paper. However, I found that, indeed, his interpretations don't really apply to the current development I am trying to explain. He actually states the opposite and wrote that photography also lacks an aura due to the mass production of film, which eliminates the uniqueness and consequently the aura of the photographs. Opposing this argument, Dominic Schrey describes analog photography to be surely unique and in possession of an aura, thanks to the singularity of each photograph that is physically engraved in the emulsion of the film. Compared to digital photography, which does not exist physically and can be reproduced in no time with a couple clicks, this statement seems to be quite valid. Another argument which supports the theory of film photography's aura is the materiality of the medium. Professor Mary Ann Doan put it nicely in an article from 2007. She wrote, "What is lost in the move to the digital is the imprint of time, the visible degradation of the image. The age of photographs and of films is traced not only in their deterioration, but in the type of film stock, lighting, color system, and so forth." I find this to be a wonderful point to refer to when trying to explain the popularity of film. This is another factor which contributes to the aura film photography carries. To find more possible reasons, I conducted a short comparative analysis in my paper opposing analog photography and digital photography in their way of being used and their aesthetics. Interestingly, but not really surprisingly, film photography can nowadays be considered technically worse, less time efficient, and less cost efficient than digital photography. So in this sense, shooting film actually does not make any sense at all. On the other hand, the aesthetics could be a reasonable argument for many photographers to choose film. Analog photography has a tendency to imperfections, whereas digital photography is the opposite. Therefore, digital photography is often perceived as too perfect. Human mistakes in the process of analog photography can add unique qualities and effects to the picture. This includes grain, shifts in color, chromatic aberration, and other details which can add a sense of character to a photograph. Such character is generally perceived positively thanks to its more unique and not so clinical look, which digital photography is often criticized for. On the search for more reasons to shoot film, I came across this concept of authenticity in photography. Authenticity is separated into two categories: indexical authenticity and iconic authenticity. When applied on objects such as photographs, authenticity in general is a factor of reality and originality of the object. Hereby, indexical authenticity means the actual originality of an object. This usually cannot be recognized by consumers, who therefore need the indexical authenticity to be verified as authentic by experts who examine the object. For example, the original painting of the Mona Lisa can be examined and determined as the original from the time of the Italian Renaissance painted by Leonardo da Vinci. If someone would show me a great replication of it, I would not be able to tell the difference. This is then called the iconic authenticity. This authenticity refers to the clearly perceivable properties of the object. So that replica, which is so precise that I as an average consumer can't tell the difference, has iconic authenticity, but not indexical authenticity because it's not the original. So how does this concept of authenticity apply to the discussion around film or digital photography? The professor of modern and contemporary art, Matthew Birot, conducted research on the differing authenticity between analog and digital photography. He came to the conclusion that analog photography appears to possess more indexical authenticity than digital photography does. He states that film photography often has a connotation to the terms truth and objectivity, whereas digital photography is more connected to untruth and subjectivism. Birot argues that due to the materiality and the overall more physical process of analog photography, film photographs receive more qualities of indexical authenticity than digital photographs. The physical imprint of analog photos on the film give it a sense of realness and a more perceptible presence in reality. On the contrary, digital photographs are dependent on the electronic device that displays them and thus can vanish in the nothingness of data anytime. Similarly, analog and digital photography differ in their degree of existence. While analog photographs physically exist on a film, digital photographs are merely the possibility to look at a picture and are only an unrealized photo saved as a code on a hard drive. To find further differences between the two, which could be part of the reason to choose film, I read a detailed self-analysis by a professor who observed his own behavioral patterns while practicing photography. In his detailed article, he first explains the so-called photographic gaze. This describes the modus he switches into when actively doing photography. The way he looks at everything changes, his focus intensifies. Everything he sees is a potential motive or subject for a photograph. I'm sure you can relate to this photographic gaze when reflecting your own behavior when shooting. At least I can relate to what he writes. He explains this because he found some differences in the photographic gaze itself, depending on the method of photography he used. While the general act of photographing doesn't differ, small behavioral nuances were observable. He found that when shooting film, his consciousness was in a state of alternation between the ordinary consciousness and the concentrated consciousness when he comes across a motive. In this moment, his focus entirely shifts to this moment and the subject. Because of the medium being film, he tends to shoot carefully and sparingly with the costliness of film in mind. Overall, he seems to shoot less and more selectively when shooting film. In contrast, when shooting digitally, his shooting style is much less hesitant. Thanks to the freedom digital photography offers him, he shoots less selectively and thus noticeably more. Consequently, his behavior seems to shift to a sort of comparison between the shot he got and what he imagines to be the ideal photograph. This comparison leads him to shooting the same subject many times until he is satisfied. This is vastly different to analog photography, which he described as a feeling of mercy to the medium because he can't check the result for another while. Something else he points out is the change in photographic gaze. When shooting film, he was in alternation between the two states of consciousness as mentioned before. On the other hand, when shooting digital, he doesn't leave the focused consciousness. He stays in that high concentration state constantly. I'm assuming this might be due to the freedom digital photography provides by allowing him to shoot as much as he wants, or his SD card allows. The main takeaway for him was the realization that his digital photography is a process of matching and adjusting the photo to the ideal he has imagined, whereas analog photography is simply picturing the subject or motive. Therefore, he drew the conclusion that his analog photography can be considered more authentic than his digital photography. I personally think this is a highly interesting conclusion, which could, in combination with the other factors, result in a reasonable explanation for the increasing popularity of film photography among young people. I myself relate to the feelings he described. I mean the authenticity, the photographic gaze, and how it is different depending on the format. It makes sense to me when reflecting my own experiences with both forms of photography, and I believe I can agree. For me personally, it's definitely the authenticity that comes from the materiality of film photography. The whole process of inserting a roll of film in the camera and later actually seeing my shots as a negative engraved on a roll of film adds this level of realness or authenticity to my photos, which makes photography enjoyable on a level I hadn't experienced previously. Additionally, I love how film photography forces me to be selective and careful when shooting because I mostly only give myself one chance to get the shot. So, this concludes more or less what I found out for my bachelor thesis and my own thoughts on the topic when reflecting my personal experiences. I'm curious to know whether you also relate to the described feelings or behavioral changes. If you shoot film, why do you? I look forward to reading through the comments. That's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, leave a like, consider subscribing if you haven't yet, and I'll hopefully see you again next week in the next video. Until then, goodbye.